Hello, and welcome to another episode of AWS on Air. We are so happy to have you all joining us today. We have some awesome stuff for you, and we have an amazing guest, Lauren. And I'm joined here by Seema. So before we jump in, I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Marie. You might have seen me on some past episodes. Happy to be here today. I love getting to learn more about things that I maybe know a little about, but get to dive deep with some of our guests. And then I'm joined here by Seema. Seema, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Seema and I currently work as a developer advocate with Alexa team. And you must have seen me also on other episodes for AWS on Air. And today we're excited to have Lauren with a fresh new topic from AWS.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Lauren and I'm a solutions architect for state and local government for the state of New York.
Awesome. We're happy to have you, Lauren. And I know we've been talking a little bit. And so can you tell us a little bit about what we're learning about today? What is Amazon VPC IP Address Manager?
Yeah, so VPC IP Address Manager, or Icam for short, is a new functionality of Amazon VPC that makes it easier for you to plan, track, and monitor your IP addresses for your Amazon workloads.
Awesome. And so why would customers have multiple IP addresses that they need to have managed?
Well, an IP address is kind of like an address of your home. It directs traffic and allows resources to communicate each other across the internet. So, similar to a way that you know your friends or your mom's phone number and you type in their phone number whenever you want to call them, whenever you want to access, whether that's an EC2 instance or a database, you would need to have an IP address in order to reach those AWS resources.
Awesome. I love that example. I feel like we're still a generation where we probably remember some phone numbers, but there's definitely a lot of phone numbers that I don't remember. So having something to manage that's super important.
Yes. And what we are seeing our customers do, especially customers just starting out, is that they were using homegrown tools such as spreadsheets that they would use to manage their IP addresses. And whenever they would have a developer or somebody on their team that needed an IP address or a range of IP address, they would go look it up in the spreadsheet, get them an IP address, and give it back. Now, that was fine when your customers are small or just starting out. But when they started to expand to multiple VPCs, multiple accounts, multiple regions, and we found them growing from hundreds to thousands, or like even some of our customers have more IP addresses, it started to become very, very complex to just use a spreadsheet. And the time that it would take, whether it was sending emails back and forth or cutting a ticket, that was something that became a very time consuming process for a lot of our customers.
Interesting. So what was the problem before and how did this launch gonna help customers solve that problem? What this is actually giving out to the customers?
Right. So this is where IPAM really shines. So the issue we just mentioned about it becoming unmanageable to use those homegrown tools in a spreadsheet, um, IPAM allows you to do one of three main things. One, it allows you to automate the assignment of IP addresses. So now whenever a developer needs an IP address, they don't have to come directly to you or send those emails. They can go directly to IPAM, request an IP address, and they can get an IP address or a CIDR range of IP address in a matter of seconds. The second functionality of IPAM is that it helps you to monitor. So with IPAM, you can now monitor your IP addresses across all your regions and accounts, and you can use them to help discover things such as, are there any overlaps in my IP address ranges, which is something that is very common and very expensive to correct when you're trying to manually manage your IP addresses using a source like a spreadsheet. And you can also use some of the monitoring metrics from IPAM to do things such as capacity planning. So you can look at what percentage utilization of IP addresses you've used and start to proactively allocate more IP addresses before things like a peak season occurs. And the third core functionality or problem that Ipam solves is that it helps you to do retrospective analysis. So with Ipam, Ipam will store IP address activity for 3 years. So during that time, you can go back and look at what has happened to an IP address during that time. So whether it has moved from one EC2 instance to another EC2 instance, or whether it has entered or left your network, and you can use that information to do things like auditing, troubleshooting, and even compliance reviews. So those are some of the problems that Ipam solves to help eliminate a lot of that overhead that our customers were doing manually with their homegrown tools.
No, that's awesome. And what are some of those, what are kind of the bigger customers of this? Obviously, customers that have to manage multiple IP addresses, but what were some of the customer profiles that you were seeing?
Definitely our public sector customers. So not only is it streamlining a lot of those processes, but it comes with that additional level of security that you wouldn't get from the traditional tools that were being used before.
Interesting. The security sounds pretty awesome. So how do one get started with IPAM?
Yeah, so getting started with Icam is actually quite simple. So there are three main things that you need to do to get started with Icam. The first thing is that you create an IPAM. So you can create one IPAM in a region that you select and use that to manage your IP addresses across all of your regions. And this is actually a benefit of IPAM because even though it is a global service, you can choose the region that you want it to be hosted in. So most of our customers say that they prefer to host IPAM in the region where they have most of their workloads, but you can choose to host it in whichever region you would like. But you only need one IPAM for all of your regions. The second thing that you need to do is arrange your IP addresses based on your routing and security needs. So I do want to introduce at this point a IPAM concept called pools. Now, a pool is a collection of CIDRs, which is a notation to describe a range of IP addresses. So each pool can have a single CIDR block or it can have multiple CIDRs. But with the benefit of a pool is that when you're automating your assignment and you're writing scripts and they're pointing to that pool, the ID of that pool never changes. So if you're ever in a situation where you're running out of IP addresses, you can simply add more IP addresses by adding another CIDR to that pool without having to go back in and edit your scripts or anything you've embedded that pool ID into, because you can constantly expand that pool. Now, how you use pools to help arrange your IP address into the routing and security domains that you define is that you can split a pool into multiple pools and then split that pool into multiple pools, allowing you to develop a hierarchical structure. So, for example, you can start off with one global pool and create subpools based on different regions. So maybe half for one region and half for another region. And then you can further divide those pools into dev pools, prod pools, or if you have various business units, you can separate them based on your business units as well. So I just want to call out the flexibility of IPAM. So you have the flexibility to organize and structure your IP address space however you would like.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you introduced us to the idea of pools because this is my favorite part of AWS on Air is the demo. So I know that you're going to jump in and share a little bit about pools and everything that goes along with us. So yeah, I'll hand it off to you and definitely walk us through all the exciting things about IPAM.
Yes. So there's one more thing that I want to mention about setup before I take control of the screen. But that final thing that you do when you're setting up an IPAM is you also set business rules for allocation. So that way you're making sure that your IP address assignments and allocations are happening based on your intentions. So you want the developer accounts to get developer IP addresses, or you want certain regions to only have certain IP addresses. So when you're creating your pools and you're using IPAM, you can set those business rules to define how you want your IP addresses to be distributed and managed. With that, I'll go ahead and jump to the demo. Okay, so from the AWS Management Console, in the search bar, I'm going to search for Icam and go to our Icam service.
The internet is great. We get to experience a real live demo.
Yeah, my internet is being a little slow, but okay. So if this is your first time visiting Icam, you'll be greeted with this welcome screen with more information about the service. But I'm going to go ahead and click Create Icam here. I'm going to check this box, which allows your IPAM to allocate IP addresses into different accounts and communicate with different regions. So you have to allow these permissions in order to use IPAM. I'm going to give it a name, so I'm going to call it Global IPAM. For my operating regions, here you can select which regions you want your IPAM to track. For my demo today, I'm going to be using US East 1 and US East 2. So I'm going to go ahead and check those regions. And I'm just noting here that it is going to create two different scopes, a public and a private scope. And a scope is kind of like a container that allows you to have different sets of IP addresses that are isolated. So when you create a different scope, it's almost like a completely different environment. So we have one being created for our private IP address space and one for our public IP address space. And for today, we're going to be using the private scope. So now I'm going to click Create IPAM. So give it a couple of seconds. So now my IPAM has been created. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a pool. So we talked about pools just a couple of minutes ago. I'm going to click this drop down and make sure that it's in my private scope and click Create Pool. So I'm going to call this pool my global pool. This is going to be my top level pool that I'm going to use to subdivide further into two smaller pools next. But because this is the first pool that we are creating, there is no source pool for me to choose from. So I'll leave this alone. I'm going to leave everything else the same. But I am going to add a CIDR range here, so a range of IP addresses. So I'm just going to do 10.0.0.0/16. So I'll use this to represent my CIDR for my network. And like I mentioned before, if you start to run out of IP addresses, you can see here with this /16, I get 65,000 IPs here. If that ever starts to run out, I can come back to a pool and add a new CIDR. So you don't have to worry about the case where you start to run out of IP addresses. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to click Create Pool. Again, give that another couple of seconds to create. Okay, so now I'm going to create a subpool of my global pool, two region pools. So one for US East 1, one for US East 2. So I'm going to click Create Pool again. I'm going to name my pool US East 1 pool. For my hierarchy, now I have a source pool, and I want my source pool to be the global pool. So this is a pool that I'm subdividing further. So half of my pool is going to be used for US East 1, the other half for US East 2.
And why would customers want to split their pool like that?
It just makes it easier to manage the assignment of IP addresses. So instead of having these fragmented CIDR ranges that you're tracking in a spreadsheet, now you have one big block of IP addresses that you can now further subdivide into smaller sections. So it just makes it easier to manage at scale.
Nice. So now I need to assign another CIDR for this pool, and I can do the same thing I did before and enter a specific number. But one of the cool things about IPAM is I can also click this Add CIDR by Size,
So if I want to click and select the size, and let's say I do this last 16 for the size, what Ipam will do is just assign you the next available block of IP addresses of that size that's available. So it'll automatically assign that range here. So now I want to configure rules for this pool. And the one I'm going to configure for this demo today is the size of the VPC. So from here, I can control the minimum range of IP addresses, set a default range, and also set a maximum. So for this demo, I'm going to set 20 as the minimum, 22 as the default, and 24 as the maximum. Oh, I just realized I forgot to select a region, which is important. I want this to go to US East 1. So I'm going to check US East 1 here. And also select this automatic import so that the resources created in that VPC will automatically be detected by Icam. So then I'm going to go and click create.
Yeah, and so the great part about this demo is you're showing how quickly this could be done. So if you know what you need to do or following some type of directions or setting up a SOP for your company, you're doing this in minutes.
Yes, and there's other ways to do this as well. So I'm using the AWS Management Console, but you can use CloudFormation, you can use a CLI. There's multiple ways to do this. So whatever is more efficient for you and your teams. But I'm going to create one more pool really quickly here, just the exact same, but for US East 2. I'm going to set the same source pool as that global pool. But this time, I'm going to select my region to be US East 2. And again, I'm going to do add CIDR by size. Choose that /18 for my network size. And you'll see that it has automatically been selected by Ipam, the next available block of that size. And I'm going to configure the same net mask rules as well for my VPCs that are going to be created. So a minimum size of 20, default size of 22, maximum size of 24, and click create.
Yeah, and what are some things you would recommend customers to think about as they're creating these pools?
Yes, so I would think about how your company is organized. So at best practice, if you are operating across multiple regions, we would recommend having a different pool for each region, like I'm demonstrating now, and then further subdividing those pools. Because one of the great things about Ipam from a high availability perspective, that the region that you selected as your Ipam control plane region, so where Ipam is being hosted, is not necessarily the same region where those IP address, those subpools have to live. So for example, I selected that I wanted my US East 2 pool to live in the US East 2 region. So if something were to happen in US East 1, I can still use that pool of IP addresses in US East 2. So having that it's scoped at the region level, it helps you to design in a way that's highly available. And from there, you can do it based on business units, based on compliance needs or other, however your business is structured from there. But next, I want to show you how I can now create a VPC using the Ipam rules and the pools that we just created. So now if I go to Amazon VPC, there we go. Okay. So I go to VPC and click Launch VPC. going to click VPC only, because for today's demo, we're just focusing on creating the VPC. I'll call this my Icam VPC1. Now here where it says IPv4 CIDR block, you can either manually input it or you can have it allocated by Ipam. So I'm actually going to click this here. And now you can see I can select from one of the pools that I created in Icam. Now I can only select one that's in the same region that I'm currently in. So the US East 1 pool, I'm in US East 1, so I'm going to click this one. And you can also see that it defaults to the range that I selected in Ipam, and it only shows you the allowed options that I set in Ipam as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a default and click create. Awesome. Now I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to go back to the launch wizard, click launch, and do the exact same thing just to get a couple of VPCs going. So I'll call this my Icam VPC2. I'm going to do the exact same thing, keep this US East 1 pool selected, and leave everything else and click create VPC. Okay, so now that I've used Ipam and my Ipam business rules to create VPC, let's go back to Ipam to check out some of the monitoring and other functionalities that come along with Ipam that goes beyond just the automatic assignment of IP addresses.
And this was some of the stuff you were talking about in the beginning, kind of the monitoring and all of that is what we're about to see.
Yes, so this is just icing on the cake. So it goes beyond just the giving out or assigning IP addresses. Now you can track them, now you can monitor them, now you can gather data that you can use to influence your business decisions. So this is one of the things that I really love about Ipam is that it takes it a step further than a spreadsheet or things that we were using before. So when you go to Ipam, now I can see my dashboard. So if I want to see a summary of everything, I can find that here. But I do want to dive down a little bit deeper and go to the US East 1 pool where we created the VPCs. So I'm going to click on the pool, US East 1. And from here, I can see more information about my VPCs. So I can see at top level details, I can see utilization. So I can see what percentage of my IP addresses have been assigned. And once this starts getting closer to 100, that's when I can go back and add more IP addresses. I can see the compliance status here, which is just a check of whether or not the resources in my Ipam are meeting the rules that I defined. So are they in the appropriate regions? Are they of the correct subnet size? Which it does take a couple of minutes for this to kick in. So normally I would see those two VPCs I created here showing the status of compliance. But I can also see information about my source pool as well, which was that global pool. And I can see more information about that. But if I click on allocations now, I can see that I've allocated IP addresses to my two VPCs within my US East 1 pool. And hopefully in a couple of minutes, this will kick in and I can see them show up as a resource. And when they show up as a resource, the cool thing is that you can see their IP address usage at the resource level. So it'll show you a percentage here about what percentage of IP addresses are still available within that VPC.
Wow, this is incredible because before we didn't really have this data. So this is awesome that you're able to access this data and make smarter decisions, building out your IP structure.
Indeed. It's quite user-friendly also. Just
yes. Okay, so within your pool, you can click on allocations and you can see where your IP addresses have been allocated. And you can also click on the resource tab to see which exact resources have been allocated IP addresses that are being tracked by Ipam. So again, you can see here these two VPCs that we created, and we can also see their compliance status. So both of them are compliant, meaning that they meet the rules that we set when we created the pools. And we can also see that none of these ranges are overlapping, which is awesome. Now here, I want to call out that you can see the IP utilization from here. So when you start creating subnets and you start assigning CIDR ranges to those subnets, you'll see that number start to increase. And if you use a subnet that's the size of the whole VPC, that'll be about 100%. But again, the beauty of a pool is that you can continue to add CIDR ranges to those pools if you need to and create bigger VPCs from there. But what I want to show you now is the historical insights that you can use for that retrospective analysis. And so I'm just going to copy one of these IP addresses for one of these VPCs here, then click on IP historical insights. Now, this is where you can search for an IP address or a range of IP address using CIDR notation to view the logs of the activity of an IP address over time. So if I enter that CIDR range here and I click search, I'll see that that range was assigned to a resource of type VPC, and I can see the time. It hasn't ended yet because it's still assigned to that VPC, but as that IP address moves around, you'll start to gather more and more logs over time.
No, that's awesome.
All right, so that's all I have for my demo today, and I hope everybody was able to learn something. Now, if you want to learn more, there will be a link in the chat on how and where to get started with using Icam. And that is how Icam works.
Wow, this is super interesting. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and come back to our next episode of AWS on Air.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
everyone.
It was good to hang out, Lauren. This was really fun.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.